Thank you for logging on, joining in. It's lovely to see so many people in the chat again. This is Design Day talk number 2 by the lovely Mark Ruggett from ARM. Mark is a director of ARM Architecture, leading the office to Sydney branch. He has lead on key roles in many of ARM's most highly acclaimed projects and specializes in design concept and theory. Mark has been heavily involved with Australian universities, leading Master of Architecture studios at RMIT University and the University of Technology Sydney, UTS. Welcome, Mark. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to teach us a few things. I hope that everyone can learn a lot from this. I'm definitely really excited to listen to your presentation and take it away.
Oh, well, thanks for having me. Well, I'd like to, well, it's NAIDOC week, and not only because it's NAIDOC week, but because it's
yes, of course,
important. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country, land, sea and sky. I'm on Gadigal country here in Sydney, but our projects, are all across Australia and in fact in other countries as well, where Indigenous people have been looking after the land for many thousands of years. I also want to acknowledge any Indigenous people who are watching today, and if you are there, I'm particularly grateful for your attention, because I am going to talk about Australian architecture today, and necessarily this addresses the need for reconciliation, and I suppose our efforts towards that calling as a practice. Some of those efforts are pretty fumbling and searching, sometimes revelatory, at least to us. So I'm more than happy, and I'd love to hear your comments, correction, critique, and of course, I'm grateful for the time to talk about this work, especially during NAIDOC week. We as a practice also support the Uluru Statement from the Heart, and we do encourage our colleagues and partners and all of you to support that statement. It really is an extraordinary and generous document. And if you haven't already read it and signed up to support it, please go and do that. I'm going to hit presentation mode and share my screen in a second. So it might be that my face disappears, but let's see how we go. Can you all see our logo? Terrific. I see enough thumbs up to take that as a yes. So I'm going to set a cracking pace to try and get through. I have way too many slides and I have a dinner date, so I've got to get out of here. So let's get cracking. This is a project for Kaolin Tile Factory, and they came actually in the InDesign organization came to us and said, can you partner with Kaolin Tiles and design something interesting? And we thought, well, why the hell not? And so we decided to give it a go. This this is a digital render, but ultimately the design was on Gadigal country. It's a conical anamorph, and the cone is that shimmery thing in the middle, and the anamorph is the bit that's swirling around it. The way that it works is that the cone is the generator for the swirly bit around it. And when you look at it, when you stand in just the right spot, you see what is reflected in that shiny cone. And what's reflected in that shiny cone is the word eternity and the tiles all around it. And this is, in some ways, just some very simple mathematics about reflections and angle of incidence. But it creates this kind of remarkable effect, this remarkable translation. And it's this idea of translation that we're really interested in. And I'll talk a bit about that. This is an idea that we've been interested in as a practice for a while. This predates, in fact, my involvement in the practice. This is Howard Raggett's not Philip Johnson's glass house, where he took Philip Johnson's house that he designed for himself, which is sitting there in the middle. And what it does is we put a cone over what is the bathroom, and the reflection that's created is this remarkable plan around it, this kind of catastrophic plan around it, which looks, when modeled up in probably 3D Studio Max, looks a little bit like an ashtray. This idea of a kind of a distortion or a kind of hidden catastrophic image is one that kind of comes across, is not a new idea. It's in some ways a historical idea. This is Hans Holbein the Younger from 1533, a painting of the ambassadors, but there's this kind of mysterious smudge that sits at the bottom of the picture that you can see here. And if you stand in just the right position, you will see that skull, a kind of memento mori, but only if you know where to stand and only if you know just where to look. And that idea of a kind of perhaps a meaning that is there for those who are willing to look or willing to see is also, I think, an intriguing idea. It's about erudition in a way. So that sense of a memento mori pointing to a time beyond, and maybe, I guess in some sense, our own mortality, but also some kind of broader cycle of life, I think is something that the practice has been interested in as well. So life and death and eternity all rolled together, and whether or not architecture has the capacity to capture those grand ideas. And if we're not talking about those grand ideas, then why do we bother? Furthering that idea of eternity is this project, which is based on the eternity puzzle. The eternity puzzle was a problem posed by Lord Monckton. It was called the eternity puzzle because they thought it would take forever to solve. In the end, it took a couple of, I think, computer scientists about 2 months to solve. And they came up with this kind of wonderful solution. The problem was to fill this shape with smaller shapes, all of the same area. And they came up with these figures. When we came to do the Perth Arena, this project, we borrowed those pieces as kind of typological pieces and started to arrange those as the stadium. In this case, this is the piece known as the horse's head, perhaps for obvious reasons. And as part of that process, we designed this canopy that is a perspectival illusion of the horse's head, so that again you can see, if you stand in just this right position, it becomes the drawing of the horse's head. But if you stand anywhere else, it looks like a mess of pipes, perhaps plumbing or weird, ancient structure. And I guess when we think about this theme of regeneration, these are the sorts of themes that we are thinking of. We are thinking about regeneration for eternity, but also the generation of architecture and how architecture might be generated out of a process and out of an internal logic for the project. And it's this sort of tussle between having to produce, but also having to think about eternity that seems like such an intriguing proposition. In this case, Perth Arena is in Whadjuk country in Perth. This is Arthur Stace. So again, returning to this, coming back to that reflection of eternity in the conical anamorph. Arthur Stace was known as Mr. Eternity. He used to get up at 4:30 in the morning, most mornings in the week, and he'd go around and write this word eternity in chalk, which is such a wonderful kind of combination. the word eternity in the most kind of temporary of kind of graffiti. And it was a kind of, I suppose it was a kind of evangelism. And he was quite a mysterious figure for a very long time because no one knew who he was. This image on the right is the only extant version. It was written on a chalkboard and someone managed to keep it. We used that figure as the image to generate our pattern. So you can see here the word eternity in the middle and that kind of catastrophic smudge around it. And again here in the image on the left, there's the cone, there's the image that is to be generated, and then there's the reflection all around. And you can see there that grid describes, I guess, the fairly simple mathematics and distortions that are there to create the ultimate form. And this is the product. So you can see the tiles, proudly produced by Carolyn, and the cone that is doing all the work, and the result, the resultant reflection and figure. I do want to actually acknowledge Marcy Dunas, who worked on this and did an extraordinary job. She's a student at UTS and really managed this from start to finish in production. So for those of you who are still students and you're not working in an office, go and work in an office. It's good fun, and there's things to be made and things to be done. That word eternity does crop up elsewhere in our practices. We've already seen from Perth Arena. Here you can see that bit of chalk scribble ended up in lights on Sydney Harbour Bridge. And interestingly enough, that white building in the front is another one of our projects. Not originally, of course, but coming in later, the Sydney Opera House, which is on Gadigal country. We are working on the main concert hall, doing some remedial works, and I'll come back and talk a bit more about that. But it's an extraordinary idea to alter a building of that kind of standing, and how you might find your way into it, I think is a kind of nerve-wracking process. But you take some solace from something that Johan Utzon himself, that Johan Utzon himself said, and is part of the Utzon design principles. So I suggest that modifications can be made as the questions and needs arise. Whenever somebody wants to remodel something, refurnish areas, you could look back at the ideas that were being developed. Some of these might be viable today or at the time when the change is called for. And some of them have been outdated because of huge technological advances. And of course, that is exactly the case here, that we are to regenerate the Sydney Opera House into a concert hall of contemporary standards. Of course, it's not the first time that's happened, and eventually Utzon was forced out of his commission, or forced to resign his commission, and Peter Hall took over. He was 35 when he took over the job of the Opera House, which just seems terrifyingly young to take on such a massive task. And really, he was tasked with solving all of the interiors, and it's this interior, the large concert hall, that much of our attention has been focused on. Those of you who know the background of Peter Hall, he was eventually kind of pure blacklisted by the architectural community. It's a very tragic story. But for us, working on the Sydney Opera House is like doing plastic surgery on the Queen. You really don't want to fuck it up. You will never work again. In our case, we are one of a number of architects working across the Opera House generally, and our focus is on acoustics, functionality, and accessibility. At the moment, the Opera House, the concert hall, it's very laborious to turn over, say, a matinee concert to a rock concert in the evening. It takes a huge amount of effort, and this is one of the world's busiest venues, and so making the operations of the hall easier and access to the hall easier for all comers is incredibly valuable in operations. We were tasked partly with providing access for all abilities, and that means cutting into the original building. You can see here with that plan, we need to get up these stairs to a whole new level right at the top. And we discovered in Utzon's original drawings that there were these tunnels cut in the stair. And you can see that in those first theatre plats that were set down for the seating, that they were in fact cast and then cast over when they changed the two venues. And so we felt some confidence that we could cut these tunnels and still observe the I guess the important World Heritage values of the site. This is the stair in question. You can imagine that when you're going to cut into the Opera House, the design team gets fairly anxious. True to be said, everyone gets pretty anxious. And so we did quite a few options. I'll let this kind of play out. I think you'd have to say for one little corridor that this is an obscene number of options. And maybe this represents the anxiety of designing anything, but particularly with engaging a building of such international importance. And that there is the final option. And if you get to the Opera House, you can see it. It's actually finished now, and the first concert is on the 21st of July. Similarly, we were tasked with improving the acoustics. That's not to say the acoustics were terrible, but that there was room for improvement. And I guess when ARM comes to think about these things, we don't just think about them as technological, but as opportunities for design and an opportunity for generating a meaning or a new understanding for those spaces, that it's not only technocratic, but that there's a possibility there for engaging with architecture. In this case with chymatics, which is the kind of envisioning of sound, which interestingly enough, you can see it in the stained glass windows of old cathedrals, and they appear to map into the sonic patterns of sound. And here, you'll see if this will play, that we use this idea of kind of the resonance of a sound and the vibrations that a sound might make in a surface to begin to think about new acoustic treatments around the concert hall. We needed to add extra ornament and extra mass to these box fronts and in the stage surrounds. And so this process started to create these quite variegated ornamental panels within their routed solid timber. And it gave us the right amount of variation and the right amount of kind of mass and ornamentation to get to improve the acoustics of the hall. These on the left are two of the kind of sample panels, and on the right, one of the stage doors. You can see rippling in the moment it's open. This is again one of the walls further back above the stage, and these surround the room, so you can see them around here. I think one of the things that I think is wonderful about this is Australian materials and Australian know-how that's going into such a famous Australian venue. I think some wag said that Australia is an opera house with a country attached. Seems pretty true. Another project here, and this is maybe where we start to get into our kind of attempts at understanding Australian identity, and I think the issue, and particularly the issue of reconciliation going forward. Here, the National Museum of Australia, which is in Ngunnawal country, and we were charged with the design competition suggested that there are these critical axes. This, the land line, and the blue, the water line, and we added another line called the Uluru line, which cut through the site as well here to acknowledge the deep relationship to country that Indigenous people have over millennia, forever, in other words. And rather than thinking about these lines as clear axes in some kind of École des Beaux-Arts sense, the practice thought of this as a kind of tangled web of stories, a knot of stories, and that these axes were not simple things, that these were kind of song lines that in contemporary Australia were tangled and were complex, and that we now had a sort of tangled destiny or a knot of stories. And this became the kind of generative image for the project. And at the very heart of the museum, they entwine in a knot, a giant knot that is then subtracted from the volume of the Great Hall. So this is a photograph of the Great Hall at the National Museum, and you are essentially standing inside of a giant knot, and it has all of the kind of complexity and incomprehensibility of a contemporary Australian society. And this seemed like a kind of great symbol for how the nation might begin to contend with its stories and history, and begin to think of ourselves as entwined and reconciled people, but still in a I guess a complex relationship. Of course, you don't necessarily know you're in it unless you have eyes to see and ears to hear. But you might also, those of you who kind of know the Opera House in detail, might recognise that this window detail is the same window detail as used, as designed, in fact, by Peter Hall and Arup for the glazing at the Opera House. A beautiful solution. And so this is the National Museum. It's made up of these puzzle pieces which form a kind of stadium around what's known as the Garden of Australian Dreams. I want to talk briefly about this building here, which is the Gallery of Aboriginal Australia. Some of you might recognise that it bears a striking resemblance to Daniel Libeskind's Jewish Museum, designed in 1988, but not delivered until 2001. And those of you interested in land art might also make the connection that it looks like Michael Heiser's Rift from 1968. The Jewish Museum, of course, is not a Holocaust museum. It is the Jewish Museum, but in Berlin, but interrogates the idea of absence and the absent Jewish community in Berlin that were once so integral to its cultural life. And at the National Museum here, this building is the Gallery of Aboriginal Australia, and also somehow points to this other story and the narrative of our history, and questioning whether or not there is a contentious history that we need to still address. In that same vein, the building was commissioned by the Howard government. Most of you probably don't remember the Howard government, but they John Howard famously refused to apologise to the stolen generation. That's him standing there at the launch of the National Museum. He viewed this as perhaps a deep failing in the Australian history, but not one that the Australian people were responsible for, and therefore there was no apology to be made. Kevin Rudd ultimately did apologise to the stolen generation in, I think, a great step towards reconciliation. ARM clearly, as you can see, have an abiding interest in the issue, and began to kind of think about, well, if this is part of Australia's story, how do we begin to tease that out? One of those ways that the practice dealt with, and this project is before my time in the practice, was the building is covered in this braille, and each braille dot is about as big as your head. So if you're blind, it would be quite difficult to read, and there are probably very few sighted people who can read braille at, just by looking at it. So it's not a legible text, but it is a text nonetheless. And it says things like, she'll be right, and good as gold, and Resurrection City. But someone in the government went through and did their due diligence and translated the braille manually, and they found that there were parts of the braille that said sorry, which you can imagine, when the government had steadfastly refused to apologise, was something that didn't go down well. And the government demanded that the sorry be redacted from the building. The way that you cross something out in braille is you put larger dots over the smaller dots, which eradicates the text underneath. And so when you go to the National Museum, you'll see these silver dots kind of distributed over the building, and those dots redact the word sorry from the building. So in fact, the National Museum does not apologise, and it does not offer up that apology. But perhaps somewhere beneath that redaction, there is some contrition. Equally, the Garden of Australian Dreams, which was designed by Room 4.1.3, Australian Landscape Architects, has the top end of Australia as a giant map, and includes Western colonial names as well as Indigenous place names, and boundaries of country, of clan, and sites of massacre. So also begins to try to contend this history. Each of these pieces is a question of translation. The braille and how that might be translated, or a failure of translation. Liebeskind's museum, Michael Heiser, a rift through to Liebeskind's Jewish Museum into our Gallery of Aboriginal Australia, is begin to contend with this idea of translating or regenerating things that have come through to us through time. And here too, one I'm sure you all know, Le Corbusier's Villa Savoye in the suburbs of Paris, maybe the great white building of the 20th century. But what would happen if it were brought into Australia? How could it be interpreted? In this case, it becomes the kind of black Villa Savoye. In this case, it's the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, which seemed like an appropriate narrative. At the other end of Australia, this is the Melbourne Shrine of Remembrance on Boonwurrung land, and right on axis with Melbourne City. We were charged with, again, solving access issues. We did that by carving out these great courtyards, and which you can see here the 4 courtyards around. Each courtyard has its own theme, and that might recall perhaps elements of memorial and fields of battle. Here, perhaps the kind of foxhole in North Africa. Here, the poppy of the European Great War. Here, the Southeast Asian field of battle. And I think each of these are kind of empathetic view. Rather than the axial, heroic view, these become the view of the soldier in the foxhole. And that somehow introduces an idea of empathy to memorialization, not only heroism. This room also, the red room, is to me an extraordinary room. I think in the history of memorialization in Australia. It's based on Sadako Sasaki's paper crane. She was, I think, 10 or 11 when she contracted cancer following the bomb in Hiroshima, and she attempted to make 1,000 paper cranes. The Japanese were, I suppose, our enemy in the Second World War, but now that enmity is gone, and we are allies and friends. And so it seems wonderful to me, a great act of empathy, to include that within the shrine itself. Even in my own life, that would have been. I remember a time when there were people who wouldn't buy a Japanese car, and so to include that, I think in the shrine is an effort towards or an acknowledgement of reconciliation with one-time enemies, and the hope that perhaps we could be reconciled as peoples and recognize and have empathy for one another's suffering. At the other end of the Melbourne's axis is another one of our projects. This project, Barrack Tower. It was once said that Melbourne's axis is bookended by death in the shrine and hops in the old CUB brewery. But when we came to work on that site, we thought, can this site be redeemed somehow? And can it point to some deeper history? And eventually, the design team came on this idea of commemorating William Barrack. Philip Adams said he was a man of quiet dignity who became a leader, and despite all atrocities and provocations, rejected hatred. A man who tried to reach across the racial abyss to the white man. He was a Wurundjeri man, and we worked with the Wurundjeri people to develop this design. His extraordinary face, this extraordinary face writ large, looking down the axis of Melbourne, perhaps back at the shrine, back at the kind of colonial memorial. Memorialization like this is not a simple thing, and there were those who were deeply offended by the design, and it caused no small controversy in Melbourne. And you can see from those titles that it was a challenging building for those who have a true interest in reconciliation and Indigenous rights, and for those of us who are interested in the process of reconciliation and what role we might play in that. And I think it challenged the practice too. Doreen Garvey-Wandin, who was William Barrack's granddaughter, great-granddaughter, did, however, think that it was something wonderful. Something like this has been a long time waiting, and I think it's wonderful. My great-grandfather would be so proud. However, the process of reconciliation is ongoing, and it is not a simple process. But a building like this is perhaps only a moment in time as reconciliation grows and continues. And perhaps one day in a reconciled Australia, this building might just sit within the city and have still glanced back down the street at the shrine with a nod and a wink, perhaps. Moving on, this is back into Sydney. This is the Blacktown Exercise and Sports Technology Hub on Barrack country. And I'll race through this a little bit, but needless to say, we were interested in sports technology and fabrication, and we were interested in the incredibly diverse population of Blacktown. And how we might celebrate that diversity in a kind of sense of inclusion within the architecture of this building through a process of translating these historical styles and these strategies into a new building. So let's, for example, looking at color, at threshold, at all over ornament, at all over color, and also these kind of spatial kind of poche spaces as well, and how it might become a unique outcome, something, a building that is both unique to Blacktown but also recalls these other styles. Again, where is the kind of Indigenous story here for us? Blacktown was a racist title for the town, and there was a move to change the title, change the name to a more sensitive title. But in fact, the Darug people said no, like you can't eradicate your history. That this name that you've given is critical to understanding the history, and maybe then this black building too recalls some of that story. Hopefully you can see how some of those so-called foreign styles find a new translation and are regenerated here in this contemporary architecture. Just a few photos of that. This is under construction now. I'm almost there. This is all of this kind of stuff requires a bit of self-critique, interrogation, explanation, and documentation. So we did a book, which is not architecture. It's not even a building, but it tries to capture, I guess, 30 years of the practice of architecture, and while also in some ways being more than just a terrible act of narcissism. This book had 16 separate authors and 1,616 pages. That, by the way, 16, 16, 16 was just a coincidence, one of those bizarre things. We thought of it as a bit of an illuminated manuscript where words and image work together to communicate, that it's a kind of, each page is its own composition, both decorative and communicative, and that maybe that seemed like a metaphor for what design really is. And so it's a kind of Australian illuminated manuscript. You can see here in that graffiti that the anonymous graffiti artist and cultural critic is asking, I think, some incredibly profound questions within that profanity. Very pithy phrase, but really I think they are asking, who do we support? Are we as a community defined by who we choose to support? And if we fail to support one, are we condemning the other? I think they are asking, when should we just give in to the tide of history? And when should we resist? I think in the end they're asking, is resistance futile? But I think in that pithy phrase, there's much for us to think about in an Australian context, and how we might think about design and how we might think about our built environment. Ian McDougall founded a magazine in Melbourne called Transition Magazine. Ian McDougall is the M in ARM, and it was a magazine of local discourse. It was both a kind of elite document, but also one that was intensely local, and in some ways generous, open. the letter on the right, on the green page on the right-hand side, was written by an inmate at Pentridge Jail who was requesting copies of Transition. I thought that was a wonderful idea. But the book itself is a kind of act of self-criticism and a kind of an open act of self-criticism. ARM very rarely publishes drawings, but here we took 7 key projects and we published their full drawing set. There are QR codes that allow you to click on the QR code and it will launch a PDF that is the entire drawing set for that building, which is a kind of open invitation to interrogation. But for us, the book became that vehicle for self-critique and explanation through the drawings. The book begins to take on some of the kind of viscera of the subject matter, as if the kind of design of the book is beginning to take on the experience that's described in those words. I think in this case, we're looking at we're talking about the World War I trenches and architectural memoria. And here, the way in which maybe buildings might kiss, they might have another kind of softer side. I think also the other vehicle, not only looking to ourselves, but looking outward and into a kind of deeper culture and how we might learn more, engage more, so that through teaching and studying, we have to take the time to learn in order to understand. This was a very ambitious title, Decolonizing Architecture Through Practice. Maybe it's not possible, but the ambition there is there nonetheless. These were with 2 research students at RMIT, Michelle Gann and Sheridan Hurst, and they prepared this extraordinary document that documents the kind of a timeline of colonial architecture of display and architecture's relationship to minorities, to those who are excluded from museums, who are excluded from the agency to curate, and particularly the ways in which Indigenous people's artifacts are often stolen and then redisplayed. And a particular case study, which some of you might know about, is the Guagal Shield, which is a shield of the Guagal clan of the Dharawal people. It was collected at Botany Bay in April 1970. It is in the collection of the British Museum. It was collected by James Cook, then I think Lieutenant James Cook, and Joseph Banks. The documentation says that they landed at Botany Bay and 2 men came forward with spears. Cook fired a shot, hitting a man in the leg. The men retreated, dropping the shield. And it's suggested, and not actually confirmed, but it seems likely that this is the shield that Cook and Banks collected. It shows that these engagements were often tense and often violent. In the case of the British Museum, it's displayed in this kind of rather dour kind of case. And when this shield went on kind of tour as part of an exhibition, it was presented in a chronology of when it was collected. But when that same exhibition came to the National Museum in Australia, they reordered the entire exhibition such that it was arranged regionally. So where the object is from, not when it was collected, which puts the emphasis somewhere else within that kind of that. I think it shows the kind of power that a curator might have in understanding these objects. Similarly, when displayed in the British Museum, it's lit from the front, and when it was displayed in the National Museum, it was lit from behind, so that the bullet hole that is left in the center of the shield is visible as a light, and so that it is almost a display of that act of violence, not only the object itself. And these somehow became incredibly meaningful. I think these are incredibly meaningful insights into the history of our engagements here in Australia, and I think the depth of anguish that we have to surmount in the process of reconciliation. This is just a zoom in of that timeline. Speculations, propositions, and trajectories. These are kind of readings or translations of the architecture that the students observed. I think the titles here are probably enough to get a sense of where this research took us. The impact of loss and absence, symbolic representation of the truth within form, framing perspectives of forgiveness through apertures. Which I think I might leave them at that because there's a lot to unpack there. But similarly here also the documentation of possible futures, an honest narrative, public right and ownership of art, and redefining public space, prioritizing interaction. So again, these were propositions about how the museum might rethink itself and how we might rethink its place within our cities and within our urbanism, and how we might begin to generate a new understanding of display, I suppose. We continued that research into another semester. I won't go into this other than to say that these translations, these are comparisons for understanding, as if these images or these histories might be ways of understanding each other. So here, rock carvings bear perhaps a lineage or a vehicle for understanding through Le Corbusier's modular man. And there are a number of these which are I think, very intriguing and are a kind of stepping stone to understanding one another and finding perhaps some common ground. This is the last project, Monash University Chancellery. So for this project, we do acknowledge the Kulin Nations. And here for us, this is, I guess, a new step. So perhaps if the earlier projects were about advocacy or protest or translation, perhaps now it's about commissioning, and that, by which I mean maybe we need to get out of the way, maybe we need to make room and create the opportunity for expression for others, not for ourselves. And so this project, I think, is in many ways about creating opportunity and about getting out of the way. And so there are a number of commissions within this commission. Here, Manapan Millennium Island in Arnhem Land designed one of these columns, and each of these columns will be a new commission for someone not us. And then inside, this is actually not a commission, but a reference to Margaret Preston, who was actually one of the first non-Indigenous artists to recognise Indigenous motifs. And it's there here, one of her pictures writ large on the ceiling. But importantly, I think Kayla Arts gathered together a number of artists and offered commissions to, I guess, complete the building. Eva Ponting, Suzanne Atkinson, and Cornelia Manamuri, and Manapan as well, this ginormous desk, which boardroom table, which I think is just an extraordinary piece. But so rather than architects only providing answers, perhaps now the next step for us is creating opportunities. I think if we take the issue of reconciliation seriously, then we have to question the foundations of our discipline. That if in our education and in our practice we rely on precedent, and most often foreign precedent or colonial precedent, then how can we claim to be working towards a reconciled nation? And I think if we begin to take those questions seriously, we have to question the foundations of our discipline, and and ask whether or not there is an alternate future for this practice, which is both disconcerting and exciting. That's my last slide, and I know that I'm leaving you there with something of a kind of quizzical proposition, but I think that is where we are in contemporary architecture, and I think that's both terrifying and exciting.
Well,
Thanks.
thank you very much, Mark. That was very inspiring. I feel like we've kind of seen some very deliberate ways of responding to the hidden agencies of you find in place, and the hidden narratives that you find in place, and really strong kind of representation of that. I feel like from everyone in Super Studio, it's like a great way of thinking about the ways that they'll approach their chosen site. I think you know, I can't wait to see what happens with everyone's projects, because this obviously has opened up a few doors for some people. I think people might even be stuck, you know, coming up with a form or an idea, and something has clicked for them. So I hope that's happened for you all today. Thank you so much again for your time, and I think we're going to open up now for a 5-minute Q&A. Matt, as well, as a creative director, it'd be amazing to hear your perspective on these questions as well. So anybody who has a question, please raise your hand. Aramel obviously has a question.
Great. So, Mark, my question to you is, how does someone design for eternity?
That's a good question. I don't know, but then maybe that's the thing that we're trying to engage with, is how do you, it's more about that, the engagement of that question, I think. But maybe it's also about pointing at that, at the world that we would like, you know, the world that we would like to live in. You know, maybe we're already in it, and we've got to make that future. So, you know, when Arthur Stace was really, you know, his question was, where will you spend eternity? And that future is something that we are creating now. So maybe the question for us as designers is, what's the world we want to live in, and how do we design for that? Yeah.
That's beautifully said. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you for that, Aramel. Matt, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I've got a question. So a lot of the stuff you spoke about, a lot of the way that ARM works involves deep consultation with the groups that you're trying to work with and trying to engage with. From a university student perspective, was there any kind of steps you'd recommend to take, given that, you know, often you're not able to engage with these groups? And I think this is true of regenerative design as much as it is with the stuff that you're speaking about. Do you have any kind of perspectives or experience there in your teaching?
Look, I think this it is a challenging issue, I think, and it's hard to learn as a student, but because maybe you don't get, maybe the opportunities aren't put before you. I think we as architects are often taught that we have the answers, that we go into a meeting or we go into a process saying it's my job to come up with answers. The thing that I have found as I've worked in practice is that most of the time I am asking questions, and we begin a process usually being about 95% wrong about everything. And you hope that through that process of asking questions and through that process of working methodically with people and humbly with people and with openness, you are maybe 5% wrong at the end. You're still going to be wrong, but maybe only 5%. And I think that any project is a relationship, right? Any project, any building that you're working with has built into it myriad relationships, whether it's your client, a project manager, the guy on site, whoever it is, like and your colleagues, especially large projects. And so they're often a product of these kind of conversations you have along the way, and the decisions that you come at. And so I think that the way that you can practice those engagements is by coming at it with a willingness to question your own position and question the validity of your assumptions, and test those and interrogate those assumptions as you would interrogate anyone else. Interrogate it, in fact, I think more rigorously. And I think then when you come to that opportunity to engage with user groups, you'll be ready, because you'll be coming at it with a questioning mind and a degree of humility. That doesn't mean that you're not opinionated, by the way. It doesn't mean that your work is not also expressive. It doesn't mean that your work is not brimming with ideas and ambition, but that is somehow inclusive and empathetic as well. We hope.
Yeah, great. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Wow. The idea that just self-questioning, I think, is a really big one for this kind of work, to constantly question yourself and what kind of things that, like, structures have built up that you don't see behind yourself, and then that way you can open yourself up to a lot of other things. I really like that. Thank you so much, Mark. We have a question by Josh, who said he came into the presentation late, but he was wondering about the method of using axial lines from a plan aerial view, which was found early in your presentation. Do you find that this works to achieve different intentions, like connecting different people at different places, for example?
Oh gosh, that's a very big question.
So do you find?
Yes, the axes, I mean, in some ways, axes are kind of convenient because they're within the history of architecture. We like to kind of problematize them and turn them into something else, like tangled knots or glancing views, or and to recognize that the axis is a complete kind of construction. But if you're interested in axes like that, go away and read up on Baroque urbanism and the École des Beaux-Arts. And there's some really interesting narratives around these kind of gravitational pull of nodes and axes within the city. You could look at Christopher Wren's, for example, Christopher Wren's plan for London after the fire of, what was it, 1666. Really fascinating stuff, and it goes to that point of connecting places almost in a cosmic sense. Yeah. Also, you could look at Michael Heiser in a completely contemporary way. Yeah. Now it is 6:30, and I know that we're past our time. Thank you, Josh. That was an interesting question. I'm going to have to run, believe it or not. I have a dinner date.
Thank you so much.
I'm sorry to dash out, but I really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
No, that's all right. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy your dinner date. Hopefully it's been good. Thank you so much for your time. I feel like this has been a really inspiring talk, and it's a great way to kind of end our design days, and for everyone to get started, creating.
Great.
So yes, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your knowledge. So thank you very much.
No, and thank you for your attention. I really appreciate it. Bye all.